Well, here's the cherry on the cake. One more time, Dr. Jonathan Sarfati.
Oh, well, lucky last one. Right. Well, thanks for sticking around so long. Of course, this is a pretty important topic because we have the world's leading atheist and Darwinist writing a book. First of all, he's written lots of books trying to attack God. He's absolutely contemptuous of Christianity. And Darwinism is a big crutch for his atheistic faith. There's no question there. The God Delusion, a very anti-Christian book. And you see how anti-Christian he is. I mean, look at this statement here that he thinks that sexual molestation is less damaging to children than religious training. This is God hatred. I call it misotheist, a God hater. I also call it an atheopath, someone with pathological atheism and anti-Christianity. Now, his latest book called The Greatest Show on Earth was written, he tells us, because he recognizes that his previous books had not really given evidence for evolution, but had assumed evolution to be true. So on the Darwin bicentennial in 2009, he decided to remedy that, he thought, by presenting the best arguments he could to prove evolution correct and proving Christianity and creation wrong. And the thing is, there he hopes that he's actually underlying his previous books, which assumed evolution to be true, by actually presenting the arguments. But you see, even after his book was written, he's admitted there are still difficulties for the evolutionary theory. This is from Dawkins' own admissions. He had to admit the origin of first life by chemical evolution is a complete mystery, he admits. And the thing is, as I mentioned last talk, you cannot use natural selection to explain the origin of the first self-reproducing machines or cells, because you need to have self-replication before you can pass on any information selected. And then the origin of sex, well, because sex is actually a very strange thing to have, really, from an evolutionary perspective, because people only pass on half their genes instead of all their genes. So it's a waste of half your genes. But in fact, it has its uses. Once it's already complete, you can see its benefits. But how to get it that way, when you got all these different things that had to match up so perfectly, what happened in the meantime? You'd have sterility. And the origin of consciousness. You see, consciousness is something which he can't really explain. And even why do people do good things when we are the result of survival of the fittest, or we rearrange pond scum? How do you explain the origin of good and evil under such a worldview? See, he admits himself there are problems with his theory. Now, one thing he does, which is quite deceitful in a way, we first of all got to work out what evolution is supposed to be about. See, the real theory of evolution, which is under so much dispute, it can be called the general theory of evolution. It says that all living things came from a single cell, which itself came from a primordial soup. And for that to happen, you realize that information must go uphill. That's the basic problem for evolution. Where does the new information come from? You see, the primordial soup wouldn't have any information at all. In fact, you're lucky if you even get some of the letters of information with DNA in the primordial soup. They don't seem to form. The letter C, cytosine, doesn't form in primordial soups. And then the first living cell has about 600 kilobytes of information, the so-called simplest living cell. There's no such thing as a simple cell. But then humans have 3 gigabytes of information in each cell. So you see that you have to have this idea of information going uphill for evolution to work. So I call this picture from goo to you via the zoo. Now, it's very important to understand this because there's another pseudo-definition of evolution, and it's this fallacy of equivocation. You're using the same word to mean different things, because here it's Dawkins saying where there's a systematic increase or decrease in the frequency with which we see a particular gene in a gene pool. That is precisely what we mean by evolution. But hang on, if that's the case, then all CMI scientists must be evolutionists. There's no dispute about that. All of us believe that genes increase and decrease. There's no dispute there. See, this is what's going on. It's switching. You're playing bait and switch. by saying this is something which is not disputed at all, and then intimating that creationists deny that things change. Well, of course we believe things change, but do they change in the direction that evolution requires? This goo to you picture of information going uphill, well, no, they don't. So you see what's happening here, where you got to someone like Dawkins, I see evolution happening in my lab. It's a fact, and what he's saying is that butterflies turning into butterflies, or bacteria turning into bacteria. But of course, what people think, which is what's under dispute, is microbes turning into microbiologists. Amoebas turning into anthropologists. You get the idea? It's a totally different thing. It's called bait and switch. It's called equivocation. And that's why I think it's so important that Christians are familiar with the rules of logic, so they can actually recognize logical fallacies and use logic to defend the faith themselves, which is why I've got this DVD called Leaving Your Brains at the Church Door, ? So I believe that logic is non-negotiable. Every Christian should understand the basics of logic, because really it's not too difficult. Another thing about CMI is one of our ministries is to produce the bullets that other people can fire, because we can't do everything on their own. We are here to train the troops to do that themselves, because let's face it, most witnessing happens one-on-one, not through a big guru at the front of a lecture, but one-on-one witnessing with your family, your co-workers, your fellow students or whatever. So we are here to train people to use the good arguments as well as providing the bullets to fire. And sometimes it happens in reverse, because in fact you've got Dr. Joseph Caselli from the Arizona Origin Science Association, president, and he's actually made a whole lecture series about the greatest hoax on earth. I'm only giving one talk. He's giving about a dozen talks based on the greatest hoax on earth. So I've given him bullets to fire, but now I'm using some of his bullets. You see, it's only fair, isn't it? He's made a few nice slides, so I'm going to use some of his slides with permission, of course. Now, one interesting thing, first of all, to get back to the bait and switch idea, what is a created kind? And some of that goes back to Linnaeus, who is called the second Adam, because he was classifying the animals just like the first Adam did. There was no contradiction. Remember, Jesus Christ is called the last Adam, not the second Adam. So he says no contradiction there. Jesus is the second man, but the last Adam, if you read the text. And so he was a biblical creationist. He believed that God created things to reproduce after their kinds. So the founder of classification was a biblical creationist. But what happened later on is you have a confusion about this term species. You see, the word in Genesis, in the Latin translation, the Vulgate, where we have kind in English or min in Hebrew, we have the word species in Latin. You see, that's what the Latin words. But then the word species has been changed in meaning. Because nowadays we talk about a biological species, which is a group of organisms that can interbreed among themselves, but not with another species. This is what a biological species is. But it's changed the definition from what Linnaeus meant, which was just a created kind. See, now you have a problem there, because we believe that species change under the modern definition. We think things reproduce after their kind, but a kind is broader than what we now call a biological species. And it's interesting that creationists before Darwin recognized this, because they looked at the biblical account of the flood and the ark. They recognized the ark would have comparatively few types of creatures on board, and yet these somehow must give rise to all the variety we see in the world today. So the pre-Darwinian creationists believed there was such a thing, what we would now call speciation, by which the types on the ark would diversify after the flood, after Ararat, into the variety we see today. So creationists before Darwin recognized this process. But what happened, unfortunately, you have these anti-Christians like Darwin's mentor Charles Lyell, who taught uniformitarianism, which is that you have long periods of time, denied a global flood. That Lyell believed in fixity of species by the modern term. So the fixity of species is not a biblical creationist idea, but in fact a Lyellian idea. So what Darwin was actually refuting in his book was actually the Lyellian fixity of species idea, but he wasn't actually refuting the biblical creationist idea. See, fixity of species is a caricature by evolutionists, and also people like Hugh Ross believes in fixity of species as well. So let's contrast the models here. See, the evolutionary model, as I mentioned, is a tree starting from a primordial soup into the branches and into the trunk, into the roots. You see, that's the evolutionary model. You see, the caricature of the creationist that Dawkins attacks frequently in his book is also the Lyellian Hugh Ross view of fixity of species, where there's been no change over time. But the true biblical view, you might say, is a creationist orchard, where you do have the distinct kinds, but you have variation within these kinds. That's the true biblical thing. And Dawkins really doesn't address this particular model, and Darwin really didn't either. They were addressing the faulty view of fixity of species, which you see why Hugh Ross, with his views, is actually quite damaging to apologetics, because he is pushing a faulty view of species, which is so easy for evolutionists to knock down. So to give you an idea of certain things, like here is the wolf kind. The dog kind is basically a wolf kind. And the kind seems to match up with either a family or genus in most cases. I think with elephants, it's the order. The thing is, these ideas, these different classifications, they're all man-made terms. So people who attack the creationists are saying, well, what's your definition of kind? You're not consistent. Well, the reason is because the man-made definitions are not consistent. So, of course, you can't necessarily match the biblical kind with one of these man-made classification systems. The thing is, we can think that there are plenty of these, like this is the wolf kind, and it seems that every dog on earth seems to be descended from a wolf. That seems to be undisputed by evolutionists or creationists these days. You have lots of different types of cats, and there seems to be a cat kind, possibly more than one cat kind. I don't know. So how many cats were on the ark? Probably not that many. Only about 50 or so dinosaur kinds on the ark as well. Here's the dog kind. You see, Noah wouldn't have had to take a poodle, Great Dane, Dachshund, Cocker Spaniel, Chihuahua on the ark. He takes a pair of wolves. And from that variety, we get the dogs we see today. And as I said, this is what the early creationists realized, going from the biblical model. Even got certain types of kangaroo kind. I've got to do something from Australia, right? The horse kind. You see, look at the different types of horses that we can see. The zebra, donkey, the horse. And in fact, horses and donkeys can interbreed to produce a mule. If it's a male donkey and a female horse, it's a mule. The other way around, it's called a hinny. But in fact, sometimes you have mules which can give birth. So they really are the same created kind. And some creationists have invented this term called bara min, from the Hebrew bara, to create, and min, kind. So that's a common word you might see in creationist circles to describe the created kind. And how do you define that? Well, in fact, what they realize is that since the Bible tells us that things reproduce after their kinds, they define the kind in terms of reproduction. And Frank Marsh in the 1940s said that two species that will hybridize to produce at least an embryo are the same created kind. So obviously horse and donkey are same created kind because they actually produce mules. And you've got the German microbiologists who extended it, said that two species that will hybridize with a common species, even if they don't do it with each other, belong to the same created kind. Basically saying if A goes to the B and B goes to C, then A and C are also the same created kind. So things like the ring species would be the same created kind according to this definition. And that means fertilization must happen as well. You must have this interchange of the male and female DNA to produce a new zygote to define it as true fertilization. So if things can cross-fertilize, they must be the same created kind. You see, Dawkins seems to be unaware of this, or willfully ignorant of a lot of what creationists actually teach. So let's look at some of these things. Here's the zonkey. A male zebra and a female donkey. It's a zonkey. So that means the donkey and the horse, the donkey and the zebra are the same, part of the same created kind. Here is ligers. Now, liger is actually the biggest cat in the world. A male liger, female tiger forms a liger. So tigers and lions are the same created kind. I would assume, in fact, that the animal on the ark would probably look like a liger. And tigers and lions have diversified from a liger-type creature. And there's even a wolfen, a whale and a dolphin. You see, in fact, it's a female bottlenose dolphin and a male false killer whale. Now, you notice here, now you might talk about species, but there's a higher group called the genus. A genus contains several species. But you notice here, these two creatures actually are classified in different genera, the plural of genus. So, in fact, this shows that the kind must be even bigger than the genus, let alone the species. In fact, as large as the family. And not only is this a hybrid, the hybrid gave birth to a baby. So it's actually a fertile hybrid. So it means this actually fits the definition of biological species. They can interbreed and produce a fertile offspring. This hybrid is fertile, it produced a calf. It's fertile. Therefore, in fact, the so-called different species and genera are really the same biological species. And again, this is consistent with the biblical creation and flood and dispersion model. Dawkins really only touches on the creation. He never seems to touch too much on the flood and dispersion, or very superficially when he does. So here's an example, and there are many in the plant world where you've got these so-called different genera that can actually interbreed and produce fertile offspring, which shows that, in fact, we should be more what they call lumpers rather than splitters, lumping things together into the same kind rather than try and call them different creatures. So this is a contrast in the true biblical account with the caricature that Dawkins presents. Now, let's go back to this picture again, the evolutionary tree of life. Now, in fact, all we see in the fossil record is the twigs, the ends of it. We don't actually see the branches or the trunk or the roots. The actual evolutionary line is only in the textbook. You see, what Darwin well knew is that if evolution were true, there should be innumerable connecting links between the different kinds. That is something we just don't find. You see, they can draw these pictures here. You look at this picture, this tree of the dinosaurs here from an evolutionist, Paul Sereno. Here's the dinosaur family tree. You see how it looks like it's connecting up there. And my colleague, Dr. Don Batten, actually just redrew this based on actual evidence. Here's the actual evidence, you see. The evidence, there's no linking forms between them. You see, as I say, here is the evolutionary interpretation. Here are the facts. This is what we find. And it looks like separate special creationists. In fact, one thing which was really instrumental in turning me into a creationist in my early days was the professor of paleontology, which, like in Canada, I believe, the professor is the highest rank of academic in New Zealand. He said explicitly, the fossil record does not support Darwinian evolution. It supports a series of divine creations. But then he said he wasn't a divine creationist, and he tried to explain things away. But see, that stuck. He said the fossil record does not support Darwinian evolution, he said, and it doesn't. And here's another example here of the vertebrates in general. Once again, you see the dotted lines. The dotted lines say there aren't any fossils to represent them. We see the actual named creatures, but we don't see the links between them. Now, from time to time, you get stories of missing links. They might have told you in the newspaper, they discovered the missing link. Well, hang on, didn't they discover the missing link last year as well? And the year before that? So what did they discover? Well, here's one example of a famous missing link, the Pachycetus. It's supposed to show how land mammals evolved into whales. And the name means whale from Pakistan. And you see how they drew it so nicely? It looks also almost intermediate. It's in the water. It's got paws. It's catching fish quite happily. But then you have to ask, what was it all based on? That's what it was based on. Look at the amazing amount of evidence there. And it's worse than it looks. They only found these parts here. Notice they found nothing below the neck. You see, so how could they know what was below the neck? That was total imagination. The thing is, it's published in journals to school teachers to indoctrinate the kids into evolution. And here is what one said: in time and morphology or shape or form, Pakicetus is perfectly intermediate, a missing link between earlier land mammals and later full-fledged whales. This is what Gingerich said about it. Based only on a few pieces of bone of the skull and jaw and teeth. Now, in a scientific paper, he mentions that, but how many of the teachers reading the popular level journal, the popular level article, will see that, though? Now, later on, they found more of these bones. Here's what they found later. And here is a reconstruction based on quite a lot more bones. So, behold your whale from Pakistan. So often that's the case. The missing links are only defended when you have a few fragments of bone. Once you find more bones, you see how it fits very clearly into the classification. It's one thing or the other. Now, another thing you may have read about is Tiktaalik. I wrote about it on the Creation website. Look it up on our website. Dawkins makes quite a lot of Tiktaalik. One thing is a problem for it is Tiktaalik is supposed to be an intermediate between fish and land creatures, like the amphibians and the reptiles. It's supposed to be the ancestor of all the land creatures. It's a weird sort of fish. But then they found footprints in Poland which they dated to be earlier than Tiktaalik. So the question is, how can the grandfather be younger than his grandchildren? This is according to evolutionary dating method, which I don't accept, but they accept the evolutionary dating method, so they're stuck with the problem of having the ancestor younger than his descendants, which made the footprint, you see. So a lot of different problems there. Now, another remarkable thing is right at the beginning of the fossil record. It's called the Cambrian period. They have all these strange names of things, and right at the bottom we have the Cambrian period. Now, of course, as a biblical creationist, I believe the fossil record is not a record of age, it's a record of burial by the flood and its after effects. So in fact, something lower down is not older, it was just buried first. But the problem for Darwin is, as he recognized himself, and by the way, he's at the time Darwin wrote this term was the Silurian. You see, look here. Silurian is here, but back in Darwin's time, it had a broader meaning to include what we now call Cambrian. He said, consequently, if my theory be true, it's indisputable that before the lowest Silurian stratum was deposited, long periods elapsed, as long as, or probably far longer than the whole interval from the Silurian age to the present day, and that during these vast, yet quite unknown period of time, the world swarmed with living creatures. To the question why we do not find records of these vast primordial periods, I can give no satisfactory answer. So what he's admitting here is that the Cambrian creatures, and the huge numbers of creatures that appear abruptly right at the bottom, that's why it's called the Cambrian explosion, happened without any evolutionary ancestors. Darwin knew that was a problem, and the problem has not been proved today. Now, we, for instance, we're vertebrates. The phylum is called Chordata, but the main part of it is the vertebrates. And they've found vertebrates. A fish, it's the early Cambrian vertebrate. Right at the bottom of the Cambrian period, they found a vertebrate fossil, supposedly a very advanced type of creature, and it's right at the bottom of the Cambrian period, you see. So once again, you've got these fully developed creatures without any evidence of evolutionary ancestry. You see, here is what you expect from Darwin. You see, look what I've got here. You see, remember the family tree of evolution? You have one thing, and then it diversifies a little bit, and those things diversify a little bit more, and a little bit more, and a little bit more, and then you get it spreading out. You see what you've got, a family tree. This is what you'd expect to find from a Darwinian picture. The problem is we're not finding that. We're finding these things up here. We're not finding this tree below that. The Cambrian sort of kicks in around here, where there's no tree to explain that. The punctuated equilibrium theory doesn't help. That's the Gould and Eldridge idea that evolution happened in jumps. We're not seeing any jumps either. What we're seeing is more like This one, where in fact, the creatures have been the same right from the moment they first appear. This is what we're seeing, and which is why the professor said that it looks like a series of divine creations. Things like the haiku ichthys, the fish, appearing right at the beginning. Now, the thing is, Darwin and people after him have said, well, we don't find the intermediates because the fossil record is incomplete. What's the evidence that the fossil record is incomplete? It doesn't have the intermediates. You see the circular argument, because the fossil record already is complete. Because we have even George Gaylord Simpson, a staunch evolutionist, saying a long time ago now, 70 years ago, that the earliest and most primitive members of every order already had the basic characters, and in no case is an approximately continuous series from one order to the other known. In most cases, the break is so sharp and the gap so large, the origin of the order is speculative and much disputed. You see, there's no evidence that the fossil record does represent what we see. Most of the things that we see today are found in some form in the fossil record. So there's actually no objective evidence for incompleteness. The only evidence is that we don't find the intermediates. And this is also underlies a fallacy. Some people have said, well, what sort of God do you have if 99% of creatures have become extinct? Well, how do you know the 99% of these creatures became extinct? Because, in fact, there are only about 250,000 classified fossil species. There are millions of living species. So where does the 99% come from? It comes from this assumption of evolution of lots of transitional forms between the different things, but they're not there. So again, it's using evolution to try to prove evolution. See, circular reasoning once again. So when it comes to the fossils, I mean, I think here's the moral of the story. Everyone knows fossils are fickle. Bones will sing any song you want to hear. Now, let's look at designer thing, because in fact, Darwin's he's most famous for trying to explain the design of things without a designer, which of course suits Dawkins a lot. And here is what he has to admit, though. Biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. And the Apostle Paul would agree. He said the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so they are without excuse. And I might say that my book, By Design, which I talked about 2 nights ago, my favorite book I had to write of all my books, just from a personal standpoint, talks about a lot of the design and also shows why evolution doesn't explain it. Being a chess master, I always try to not only make my move, but also respond to the opponent's counter move. That's what I try to do in books like this. And the DVD based on this book, God the Master Designer. So I want to show you one of the animations, which is one of my favorites here, about kinesin as an example of very good design. See if this will work for me. Hope it will.
Inside a living cell is an amazing transportation system. Proteins have to be delivered to the correct part of the cell to perform their intended functions. This animation, based on a lot of clever research over a number of years, shows how it happens. Highways made of microtubules are assembled by interlocking proteins, each manufactured in accordance with the coded instructions on the cell's DNA. Marching along a microtubule is the kinesin motor, the hero of our story, carrying a huge sack of proteins to be delivered to a predetermined place in the cell. Here, the proteins will be released to fulfill their functions. A kinesin linear motor uses 1 ATP to provide the energy for each step and takes 125,000 steps to cover 1 millimeter. This amazing machine shows all the hallmarks of design.
It's this example of the amazing good designs even in our cells. I mean, this is actually inside our 100 trillion cells in our body. That's how microscopic some of these things. Because what Dawkins will do is zero in on what he thinks is bad design. Now, it's not a very good argument, really, because it doesn't prove there wasn't a design. He just says that the designer doesn't match his standards. Now, one thing he's done is, for over 25 years, it said the human eye is badly designed because it's wired backwards, he claimed. You see, think of the light's coming this way from your pupil through your eye, and here is the retina. And what he sees here is that the nerves are here in front of the light. And the light has to go through these nerves and things before it reaches the photoreceptor, the light-sensitive cell, the rods and the cones. That's why he claims there's a bad design in the retina. Here is what he says about it, and he says it in his latest book, because he's been saying it for years, okay? He said, any engineer would laugh at any suggestion the photocells might point away from the light with the wires departing on the side nearest the light. Yet this is exactly what happens in all vertebrate retinas. Each photocell is in effect wired in backwards, with its wire sticking out on the side nearest the light. But in fact, engineers, if they knew what they were talking about, definitely would not laugh at this. And there are several reasons for this. One has been known for a long time by experts in ophthalmology. We've had some on our website. I quote them in my book, like Dr. George Marshall and Peter Gurney, who are actually professional ophthalmologists. And they point out, and have for a long time, you see, these cells here are very active. They require lots of energy, which means they need a rich blood supply. And that's supplied by the choroid. A very high blood flow to the choroid there. The thing is, you don't want blood in front of the light, because blood, if you have a hemorrhage in the eye, it blocks the light completely. It's very bad for you. See, the thing is, if you had the eye wide the way Dawkins said, you had to put the blood supply in front of the light, which wouldn't be any good at all. So when you put the blood supply behind, that's why you have to shove the nerves in front, you see. That's the important thing, which Dawkins overlooked, that his superior eye would not be able to see. Or else it would have to lack a blood supply, which means you'd be about, if you had a flash camera, I've been taking some photo, I wouldn't be able to see even now, because the cells would not be regenerated after the flash. So here's a problem, which he really has no excuse for not knowing, because ophthalmologists have pointed this out for a long time. But in fact, discoveries in the last 5 or so years have really blown away Dawkins. Because what we see, this is only a very crude diagram, what they've found now is, in fact, you have the Mueller cells, which actually act as a fiber optic plate. So in fact, there's no distortion, because in fact, the Mueller cells funnel the light through this forest of nerves so it reaches the photocell without any distortion. So in fact, you've got this fiber optic plate there. So it avoids the very problem that Dawkins said was a problem, that you got light going through these nerve cells. Well, in fact, you've got this optic plate making sure this is not a problem. And in fact, it becomes an improvement, as was discovered. Some evolutionary researchers said it was an optimal structure. Because what these Mueller cells are doing, they are funneling light in a very efficient way. So you're actually getting more light collected this way. Also, you're getting rid of scattered light. You know, one problem with cameras, which they hope to solve by copying the eye design, is scattered light. You see, light bounces off the walls of a camera and interferes with the film or whatever you're doing. So scattered light's a problem with cameras. But what the Mueller cells is doing, it cuts out any scattered light. It only takes the light from the pupil. So that's one thing it does. It also avoids the problem of chromatic aberration. You know what happens when you look through a lens? The lens is like a prism, so it separates the colors of light out. Well, it's very pretty, it makes the rainbow, but it's not much good if you're trying to see an image, because you've got these colored fringes there. So what the Mueller cells do, it actually cancels out this chromatic aberration. So it actually improves the sharpness of the image. And so it does all these amazing things. So Dawkins' so-called superior design would lack the Mueller cells to do these optical improvements that our eye does. So really, these new discoveries really blow Dawkins away. He's really got no excuse anymore. And there's an article on the site about this, how his latest eye discoveries just demolish one of Dawkins' favorite arguments. Now, he does quite a few other things he does. Now, one of the most famous things he does is this idea of homology. You know, same structure with different use. That's what homology is. You see, what we notice with a lot of different things we have, the human arm, as well as forelimbs of whales and birds, you see they've got the same sort of common pattern here. You've got this 1, then you've got 2, then you've got basically 5. This is called pentadactyl, meaning 5 digits. That's what this means. It's a pentadactyl limb pattern. It's common throughout a lot of different types of things. Okay? That's what homology is. And Dawkins claims homology proves that they all came from a common ancestor. But does it really prove that? You see, it seems to make some sense that, okay, why we have this pentadactyl limb pattern is because we come from a 5-digited ancestor. That's what they claim. But when you look at what they claim to be our ancestor, they look at creatures like Ichthyostiga and Acanthostiga. Those are supposed to be our ancestors. Yet when you look at their limbs, their common ancestor doesn't have 5 digits. So homology is supposed to prove common ancestry from a 5-digited creature, yet their candidates for the ancestors don't have the 5 digits that are predicted. So in fact, it doesn't predict the evolutionary thing, the evolutionary case, because their best candidates don't have the 5 digits that are required. I mean, on a molecular level, the same thing. That's DNA and RNA and proteins supposed to prove common ancestry from a single cell, but then you look at what their first cell's supposed to look like, it didn't use RNA or DNA. So in fact, common ancestry, it doesn't actually prove what they claim it proves. Now, there's another thing which is actually called analogy, which is different structures but same use. Like the pterosaur wing, the bat wing, and the bird wing are structured quite differently, but they have the same amazing use. So I'd say what we're really seeing is that the analogy and homology point to a common designer with a plan. That's why we've got the common structures there. And the thing is, it points to a single common design as well. See, the thing is, we see the common design, but the thing is, if there's only one, if there are lots of different designs which had no relation to each other, we might think there are lots of different designers. But then the Apostle Paul tells us that the nature points to a single designer. And that's what has been called the biotic message, that the common patterns point to a single design, but the anomalies refute attempts to explain it away by evolution. This is what we're looking at there. And here are some of the anomalies we have. Like, look at these homologous structures here. They actually have a different way of developing, you see. So the result is the same, but in fact, see, human, what happens is that you develop a plate, and then you have the parts in between being eaten away. It's called apoptosis, which is a controlled cell death, you might say, cell disappearance. That's apoptosis, and that's a human thing. We actually form the bridge first, but with the frogs, the digits come outwards. So you've got a totally different way of producing the pentadactyl limb. One it eats inwards, the other one it grows outwards. So again, a totally different way of producing it. So another thing, even on the genetic level, you've got a problem here, because, you see, if the structures were homologous, it seems to indicate that on the evolutionary terms, that it comes from a common gene, the common ancestor with a common gene for these homologous structures. And they should also develop in the same way from the embryo. That's what the prediction would be, but in fact, they don't. Often the homologous structures come from different genes, and they have a completely different way of developing from the embryo. So again, are they truly homologous? I would doubt that that's the case. What they might be is homoplastic, which means that they appear homologous, but they're really not homologous. In fact, you look at some of the theories they have, more and more things are treated as homoplastic. You see, if you look in the old books, like you look at Refuting Evolution, it was refuting the National Academy of Sciences. They told us that whales came from a type of creature called mesonychids because they looked at homologous features. Therefore, whales came from them. But now they believe whales came from artiodactyls, which means that the common features supposedly proving the mesonychid ancestry must actually be homoplastic and not homologous. So the thing is, the homology is a very doubtful way of proving. In fact, it's almost a circular reason that they define homologous as coming from a common ancestor, and they use homologous to prove common ancestry. See, over and over again, you find that actually is a circular argument happening. In fact, there's actually overall uniformity of the universe as well. There's uniformity in the atoms. James Clerk Maxwell, one of the greatest founders of electromagnetism, he said, no theory of evolution can be formed to account for the similarity of molecules. For evolution necessarily implies continuous change. The exact equality of each molecule to all others of the same kind gives it the essential character of a manufactured article. It's interesting. So here's one of many scientists in Darwin's day who rejected this idea of evolution. Now let's look again at the evolutionary tree about information. You see how the simple cell doesn't have to have as much information as a horse. It has fewer instructions needed. No instructions needed for the skin or the bones, muscles, heart, leg, brain. You see, so again, this shows for evolution to work, information must go uphill. Now, a recent article in Creation magazine has some diagrams about this, about what is actually happening when we look at it. What is actually happening? We look at breeds of dogs, because Dawkins and Darwin both looked at dog breeding as an example of evolution in action. So the article called Parade of Mutants, and here's some diagrams for that. How do you breed a big animal? Let's take some medium-sized animals like the created kinds. They have a variety, as Dr. Carter said, that we were created with variety, the ability to vary. See, what I've got here, the genes here, this is the gene, the capital S means large size, the small s means small size. So when you bring these two dogs together, they can pass on one or the other, because remember, we have our information in pairs. You get one half from your mother, one half from your father. So when these dogs marry and have pups, they pass on one or the other. So you could get a dog like this, which inherited both the small-sized genes. You could have these, this one was like their parents, it's got one of each, or else you could have them inheriting the large-sized genes. Now, if you wanted to build a Great Dane, the breeders would select the large dogs and breed from them and isolate them from the other dogs. And the same with natural selection. And once again, if bigger dogs happen to do better, they might be the ones who survive to pass their information along. But ready to get a new breed, you have to isolate small populations. So this is what happens in the next step. You have all large dogs like the Great Dane. But you see, this is not evolution, because the information was already there in the parents. This is an important thing. The information's there to start with. There's no new information. So this actually has nothing to do with information. In fact, what's happened here is that information's been lost. We've lost the genes for small size. And we've also lost any other genes these carried. So it's no wonder that a lot of the purebreds have problems, because of the information depleted. Dawkins himself said that natural and artificial selection was like a sculptor carving clay from a sculpture. Natural selection is culling genes from a gene pool. That was one of Dawkins' own analogies there. So what's the only game in town is if we have somehow changed the information. That is a mutation or a copying mistake in the genes. A typo, if you like. What happens when you make a typo? Well, you have to go back and correct it. Your best computer programs have automatic typo correction. I mentioned on Wednesday night how we have amazing error-checking machines in our genes, because otherwise every cell would have 1 million DNA damages every day, on a good day. So you have these amazing error-checking mechanisms because typos are not very good. But here's an example of a typo. And the poor dog can't breathe properly, but also he has to be born by cesarean section. So there's not much good in the wild, a mutation like this. He couldn't be born without help. Or this one here, you know, we have technical names in biology, TNR, standing for totally naked rooster. So you see, here, the feathers don't develop. Now, Colonel Sanders would have loved it. But the poor rooster will freeze in winter and fry in summer. So this is not the way to go. You see, mutations destroy things. Mutations cause lots of diseases. Sickle cell anemia and cystic fibrosis, only one letter is out of place, and it causes a very harmful disease. That's what mutations do. Now, sometimes you might talk about beneficial mutation. Now, I'll give you some examples of beneficial mutation. Now, there are such things because beneficial means helpful to the creature. But in almost every case, the beneficial mutation is still a downhill change. Like this creature here, this is a wingless beetle, a flightless beetle. But the thing is, if he was on a windy island, his ancestors were swept to a windy island, landed there in a storm. Now, his offspring, if they could fly, they'd fly up and get blown away into the sea by the next gust of wind. But if a mutation happened that disabled the power of flight, then he wouldn't get blown into the sea. And therefore, he would survive and produce offspring. So here we get an example of something which has gone downhill, but it's still advantageous. It's still a beneficial mutation, but it's still a loss of something. Now here is an example of a blind fish which comes in a cave. It's called a troglobiont, a cave creature. A lot of cave creatures have lost the power of sight. You see, Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens use this as an attack on creation, but in fact there's no attack on the biblical creation model because we don't believe God created blind fish. We believe that somehow a mutation destroyed the power of sight. Now, in the wild, in the surface where there's light, obviously blindness would be a very serious disadvantage. You couldn't find your prey, you couldn't escape from predators so easily. It'd be terrible. But when there's no light, like in the cave, blindness is no longer a problem. And in fact, it might be an advantage to have no eyes because eyes are very sensitive and can be scratched and damaged easily. So in fact, you might find a mutation that shrivels up the eyes could be an advantage in the cave and no disadvantage with it because there's no lights, you see. So here's a case where you've lost something, but in fact it's beneficial to the creature. And we have flightless birds, once again, with no predators. A mutation damaging the ability to fly is no longer a disadvantage. Now, what about things like the Belgian blue? You see, look at how muscular these cows are. And the reason is because our muscle growth is controlled by something called myostatin. Now, when you have a damage to the gene that produces myostatin, then the muscle growth is uncontrolled. So once again, we have a loss mutation. It's damaged something. It's damaged the myostatin, but as a result, the muscle growth proliferates. And we've seen it in humans as well, a super baby mutation. In dogs, again, this is because we have a damage in the control factor for muscle growth. So it might be a beneficial mutation, you might think, because you might like to breed cows with more meat, but it's not. It's still a loss mutation. There are problems with these things. They reduce fertility and lots of other problems with this because of overgrowing their muscles. Their bones may not cope so well with it. Now, what about antibiotic resistance? Dawkins makes this claim about antibiotic resistance being an uphill change. First of all, he says many bacteria have evolved resistance to antibiotics in spectacularly short periods. After all, the first antibiotic, penicillin, was developed heroically by Florian Chain as recently as the Second World War. New antibiotics have coming out at frequent intervals since then. And bacteria have evolved resistance to every one of them. Now, of course, you get quite a lot of claims that creationists will have to deny antibiotic resistance. But in fact, evolution has nothing to do with this. Well, for instance, the discoverer he mentioned, Ernst Chain, this is what he said about evolution. A very feeble attempt it is based on such flimsy assumptions, mainly of morphological anatomical nature, that it can hardly be called a theory. See, Ernst Chain, the discoverer of penicillin, he was an anti-Darwinian. He was an Orthodox Jewish creationist. So clearly, evolution wasn't required to discover antibiotics. Also, it wasn't a prediction of evolution because the antibiotic resistance caught people by surprise. And then they used evolution to rationalize it, but it wasn't a prediction of evolution. So how does this happen? Sometimes there's no increased information because it was borrowed from something else. because there are genes that can pass from one bacterium to another. So clearly the information for resistance already existed in the biosphere, but was just passed on from one bacterium to another. So again, there's no evolution because the gene was already there in the population. Now here's another example of how it can happen. You see, often bacteria have very sophisticated pumps on the cell wall, which bring in nutrients, but also bring in in its own executioner, the antibiotic. Now, a disabled pump may no longer pump in the antibiotic, so it's actually saved itself from being executed by it. But in the wild, it can't cope with the other bacteria because it's got a defective pump still. So here again, it's a downhill change, but it's still it's beneficial to the germ. But you see, super bugs are really super wimps because every one of the super bugs has some sort of damage to make it resistant. And that applies to the pests as well. Every pest, like malaria, the malaria that resists something like chloroquine, is because, again, it's got some sort of disabling. Every time it's a disabling mutation. Here's another example here. You see, penicillin, it's like the myostatin example, this one. See, penicillin is often destroyed by penicillinase. And germs are producing that. There's actually a control of the production of penicillinase. So so there's some sort of control. But if there's if this gene to produce the control gene is mutated, then penicillinase can be produced without any limit. So the germ overproduces penicillinase, so it can now cope with penicillin. So it's resistant to penicillin. But in fact, it's still a downhill change. In the wild, it's wasting valuable resources producing an enzyme it doesn't need. So here's again several ways that a germ can become resistant to antibiotics, and you have natural selection going on, selecting the resistant the germs, but it's still a downhill change in every case we've looked at. Now, one thing that Dawkins has loved is another example with germs, and this is the experiments with Lenski's bacteria. Because bacteria grow so quickly, hopefully you can see lots of generation, therefore lots of evolutionary time, because they reproduce so quickly. Instead of every 20 years, it's every 20 minutes. So, of course, you get lots of generations going there. But see, he gave up trying for a long time because all he was finding was germs turning into germs, and nothing really much to write home about. And for a long time, he was going to digital organisms. But then after decades, he'd been going into this for a long time, as a really quite dedicated science, he found something. What did he find? He found a germ which really could supposedly do something new. It could eat citrate. And you have a 6-fold increase in the cloudiness of the flask because the population just exploded. Because it could now eat something which it couldn't eat before, the citrate. And see, here's the population exploding because it could get this new ability. But is it really the case, though? Let's look at this. See, what we have here is the ability to digest something else. Glucose has got 6 carbon atoms. It's in a ring. Citric acid has only 3 carbon atoms. Okay, and see, that's the germ could now eat citrate. And here's what Dawkins says. This might be a biochemical pathway in which the product of one chemical reaction feeds into a second chemical reaction, and neither can make any inroads at all without the other. But in reality, this is not the case, because in fact, all organisms can digest citrate. There's nothing new there. See, what happens, in fact, is anaerobic restoration, which means no oxygen. It uses citrate already, but because it's a wasteful thing to do, it's not as efficient as aerobic. Normally, this is turned off in the presence of oxygen. So what happens, using the cycle here, the citric acid cycle, we call it the Krebs cycle. You see, every organism has this thing. So clearly citric acid digestion is part of all living things. There's nothing new there. It already exists. But what happened with this is that somehow it was turned on in the presence of oxygen. So in fact, you've actually got a loss of a control. You've actually disabled the switch, which normally keeps this thing off in the presence of oxygen, because normally you don't want to have this thing going on. It's less efficient. But in this freaky environment where you've only got citric acid to eat, it actually turned out to be an example, a beneficial change. Okay, so here's a case where something which normally exists, but it's normally turned off, happened to be turned on again because the switch was disabled. So once again, we have an information-losing change. In this case, it's the information that turns off a switch at the right time. So I can think of it like my car alarm, for instance. You see, normally I don't want the car alarm going continuously, but supposing that the off switch was disabled, it kept on blaring, and it would probably keep the burglars away quite nicely. The car thieves would be kept away by an alarm that kept on going, but it would keep me away as well. So it's a downhill change, but it might have an advantage. And the one example, you can think about it, if you've got a car that can actually have two fuel sources, and one is less efficient, but what happens is that you're switching on both you switch on the less efficient source of power. Okay, then it's going to be quite good. If you run out of the most efficient fuel, you can use the less efficient fuel. But again, it's a downhill change that would normally not survive. And it's one of these freaky things that Lenski discovered by chance, and all the evolutions are publicizing. Dawkins spent heaps of ink on this change, but in reality, it's about disabling something. It's about disabling the off switch and not anything new. Basically, the off switch for something which exists in the germs already. So it's very important to understand these sorts of things. Then you think about what natural selection can do. What can natural selection do? We've seen a few examples where most mutations are not very big. You've seen this diagram a few times, I bet. You see, most mutations are harmful, but they're also quite small. So you've got a problem. See, the smaller the mutation, the less effective natural selection is, you see. And if most good mutations are in this region, natural selection won't even work on them. So Dawkins talks about what natural selection can do. He builds all these just-so stories, and yet most of the changes that we know of are not affected by natural selection at all. And that's something he basically doesn't even address, the fact that most mutations are neutral. And most mutations are bad and neutral. And you've got this, the whole problem here that natural selection can't get rid of the harmful changes that we're accumulating, 100 mutations per generation. Natural selection can't get rid of the bad changes and can't select the good changes. So Dawkins' whole thesis in all his books is what a wonderful thing natural selection can do, given the stories he tells. But in fact, natural selection can't do that because the mutations are not strong enough to be selected for. And we even have earlier on where we have examples of what natural selection cannot do. Now, I believe natural selection is part of the creation model. It was discovered by creationists like Edward Blythe before Darwin. But see, here's a case of birds that ate insects for food. And the thing is, McAtee wrote about this, and he said, natural selection theories assume discrimination in the choice of prey, the principle of proportional predation, so obvious from the data contained in this paper, vitiates those theories for which it donates indiscrimination. Because he pointed out that the so-called protective adaptations, which is highly evolved adaptations for protection, made no difference. That's the thing, even though the best adaptations actually made no difference, they were eaten just as much in proportion to how available they were. And the thing is, these are probably the very highly evolved adaptations. So even the most highly evolved protective adaptations really made no difference. So how much less difference would the in-between stages, the sort of 10% of the way there, if even the 100% evolved adaptations made no difference, then even less would the 10% evolved differences make, you see. So, that natural selection doesn't do what Dawkins requires of it. It just doesn't work the way he thinks. You think of a lot of all these brightly colored butterflies, these mimics, then you find that the ordinary, the white butterfly managed to do perfectly well and eats all your cabbages, which is not a bad thing, I reckon. Go for it. The thing is, that's why you wonder how the effects of these evolved things really are. Now, going back to the issue of information, here is Dawkins asks about this issue of information which you need for evolution to work.
Professor Dawkins, can you give an example of a genetic mutation or an evolutionary process which can be seen to increase the information in the genome?
So you see, he couldn't answer the question. It's a fundamental question for evolution, yet he couldn't answer it. Dawkins has also said evolution has been observed. It's just that it hasn't been observed while it's happening. And here is where he's coming from. He said that Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. He needs evolution for his atheistic faith. And the thing is, can we trust what he says? Here is another thing he's admitted. Here is a dialogue between Jaron Lanier, who says that a lot of people are uncomfortable with accepting evolution because it leads to what they perceive as a moral vacuum in which their best impulses have no basis in nature. And Dawkins says that's just tough. We have to face up to the truth. So Dawkins even admitting if evolution is true, there's no ultimate basis for right and wrong and for moral behavior. And you remember that Francis Collins and trying to appease the likes of Dawkins by believing in evolution. Here is what Dawkins thinks of the Churchian appeasers who try to compromise with evolution.
And was there a particular point that, or something that you read or an experience you had that sort of said, yeah, this is it? God doesn't exist?
Oh, well, by far the most important, I suppose, was understanding evolution. I think the evangelical Christians have really sort of got it right in a way in seeing evolution as the enemy, whereas the more, what should we say, sophisticated theologians who are quite happy to live with evolution, I think they're deluded. And I think the evangelicals have got it right in that there really is a deep incompatibility between evolution and Christianity, and I think I realized that at the age of about 16.
So you see that it's not working. The atheists know very well you can't mix evolution and the Bible, and all that happens when you try, like biologists try to do, is that you're not winning these guys over, they are winning you over. That's what these compromises they get us in one doctrine after the other, and some of them are even saying that Jesus made mistakes. In the biological group, I mentioned that in my refuting compromise talk about how they're saying Jesus got things wrong. Now, one thing I'll just leave you with a note of, which is a bit of encouragement about how Dawkins realizes there are some good points to Christianity. He said, there are no Christians blowing up buildings. I'm not aware of any Christian suicide bombers. I'm not aware of any major Christian denomination that believes the penalty for apostasy is death. So I have mixed feelings about the decline of Christianity, insofar as Christianity might be a bulwark against something worse. What an admission that atheism doesn't provide the bulwark. Atheism, no wonder Europe is being overrun by the Islamo-fascists, because atheism is no defense. The only defense of it is the true faith of Christianity and the message of the gospel, and things like love your neighbor as yourself. That is the true antidote to the things that he's worried about. And yet, he's actually undercut his own foundations, as he has to admit there. So to leave you with this, so this is what the aim of my book is, to follow the Apostle Paul. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. This is why we do what we do. This is why we do talks and conferences all around the world. We want to give people the ammunition and the bullets. We want to demolish arguments, and we want to point people to the better thing, the true bulwark against the evils of both communism and Islam, but also the bulwark against God's wrath against our sin, because Jesus paid the penalty for us. And his righteousness is imputed to us, so we can look forward to eternal life with him. This is the main reason we do these sorts of things. Okay, I've got time for a few questions. I mean, it'll be my last chance to ask some questions in the formal setting. So, yes, you got a question? It's not a real killer whale. That's why it's a false one. I don't know any more than that, though. But it clearly exists. It's in the aquarium, because this is actually done in the Hawaii aquarium. About, he's never heard of a false killer whale before, but clearly there is such a thing. A pseudo-orca. Orca is killer whale, and the term, the classification is pseudo-orca, which means false orca. Yeah. So there is such a thing. Yes, sir. The question about Allosaurus is an immature T-Rex. I think Allosaurus and T-Rex are different types of creatures. I could be wrong, but I believe they are different. But in fact, if you look at our website, in fact, I believe that there are a lot of things which were basically a T-Rex kind. I think T-Rex was actually a form suffering from gigantism. Because I think the T-Rex structure seems to be designed for a much smaller animal. The T-Rex was too clumsy at the size it was. It couldn't break its fall with its tiny limbs and would actually splatter its brains out. Never mind what Jurassic Park said. If a T-Rex ran that fast and tripped, it would kill itself. But there do seem to be things like Nanotyrannus and various things, which I do believe were the variety of that kind of creature, but designed for a much smaller variety, yeah. But Allosaurus had a bigger arms, so I think a different kind, but I could be wrong. Yes, sir. Okay, about life in the lab, I've got a good example of that. I'll just show you what's wrong with that. Now, I wrote an article about that. So look up Venter. Craig Venter is the man who did it. I wrote an article about that particular experiment and showed it wasn't time and chance. See, Venter used the information from a germ. He used the information from mycoplasma. Okay, so the information was already there. He just copied it. He admits it. And he also used the enzymes from living things. Everything he used was actually from living things. And, of course, it required his know-how. So even if he managed to do it without stuff from living things, he would still have to put his brain into it. I want to find you something which hopefully will explain things for you. This picture here. If I can just synthesize life here, then I'll have proven that no intelligence was necessary to form life in the beginning. Yes, sir, at the back there.
Not too long ago, I heard a radio program on CBC about entropy.
Yeah.
The law that says energy goes from a useful form to a non-useful form.
Yeah.
One of the arguments that was presented was that the evolution of complex life is something that is likely because it uses up energy faster.
Well, I must admit, I'm actually a PhD physical chemist, so I know quite a bit about thermodynamics. I'm not trying to brag, but the thing is, I never use thermodynamic arguments, and therefore if I don't, probably no one else should, or most people shouldn't. I'm not trying to brag here, I'm just being realistic here. It's a complicated thing. I think a lot of people on both sides don't really understand it very well. Certainly there is this law of entropy about increasing disorder. But the thing is, I would only apply that to the origin of first life. Because once you have natural selection in the equation, I think you've got a way, the evolutionists have a way out of it. So I'm a bit cautious about using thermodynamic arguments against evolution. Okay, but the origin of first life, yeah, I think there are thermodynamic arguments which come into play, which would actually go against the idea of small molecules linking into big molecules. That violates certain laws because you've got thermal entropy there because the reaction goes the other way, but also what they call configurational entropy because the difference in an ordered chain as opposed to a random chain, that's a configurational entropy, and that's something which the evolutionists haven't got a way of overcoming. So there are places for it, but I think only in the origin of first life from chemical evolution. And also, I reject the idea that the second law began at the fall. I don't believe that's true. And the reasons people think of disorder as automatically a bad thing. But I'll give you some examples of disorder, which is a good thing. When you breathe, what you do, your lungs expand, and therefore you're creating some ordered state where you've got low pressure and high pressure. Low pressure in your lung, high pressure outside. That's an ordered state. And then entropy says air will rush in to equalize the pressure, which makes it more disordered. So by the fact of breathing is actually exploiting disorder. And also when the oxygen goes from high oxygen state in your lungs to the low oxygen part of your blood, that's increasing disorder because it's more ordered to have low and high. Equalized oxygen concentration is actually a more disordered state, but you need that for your blood to absorb air. The sun heating the earth. It means heat goes from high temperature things to low temperature things. That increases disorder, but in fact we need that for life to exist on Earth. Digestion of food is a good thing because you're breaking down complicated food molecules into simple ones. That's what digestion is. So again, digestion requires entropy to be increasing. So unless you're saying that Adam didn't digest food and didn't breathe and didn't absorb oxygen and the sun didn't heat the earth, you had to say that the second law was operating somehow before the fall. Okay, so that's one of the arguments that creationists should not use, which I mentioned in my DVD. Okay, any other question? Yes, sir, Ingmar, right?
Supposedly, evolution is helping society to have a better life. Are you aware of anything where evolutionary predictions have actually helped medicine?
Okay, there's a question about has evolution helped science? Well, they claim so, but in fact, every example of that is nothing of the kind. Let's face it, first of all, a lot of advances in medical science happened before Darwin. Okay, you have vaccination by Jenner, that was long before Darwin. You have the germ theory of disease with Pasteur, which is anti-Darwinian. You have the antiseptic theories of Lister, again before Darwin, and anesthesia before Darwin. See, all these things happened before Darwin. I mentioned antibiotics developed by creationists. But then they talk about things like antibiotic resistance as being a Darwinian thing. Well, no, it shows natural selection in action, but doesn't show Darwinianism in action, okay? Because natural selection and evolution are not the same things. I mean, we must get that straight. Natural selection is part of the creation model. Another thing is, they might say that something is an evolutionary adaptation for something. Like, for instance, a cough is an evolutionary, it evolved so we could expel things from our trachea. But that's also because it was designed to do that. See, it was evolved to do it, or it was designed to do it. There's no difference in practice, you see. So that's often the thing. They talk about evolutionary, this evolved to do something, but in fact, equally well, it was designed to do something. And so all these things are examples of supposed evolution, but they really, they're pulling the wool over your eyes, though. But yes, sir, and, oh, yeah, ma'am, sorry, yes, ma'am. And has evolution hindered science? Very much so, because think of the idea of vestigial organs. You see, at one time, because of evolution, they thought there were about 200 organs in our body that were useless because they were leftovers from evolution. But now we know they all have very important functions, like the appendix. Has now long been known to have lymphatic tissue, so it fights germ, but also more recently they discovered the appendix was a biological safe house. You've heard of probiotics, the good bacteria. in your system. The thing is, the appendix seems to be a safe house. So if you have dysentery and you expel the contents of your gut, the appendix stores the good bacteria so you can repopulate the gut. That's one example of how the appendix has a very useful function. And then you have this idea of junk DNA, which is vestigial organ applied to DNA. And an Australian geneticist, John Mathick, said that was the greatest blunder of molecular biology was thinking of this idea of junk DNA because it hindered the research into what the junk DNA did, how it was basically another operating system, was extra coding in the junk DNA. But belief that it's junk means you don't bother trying to find out what it is. So those are examples where evolution has hindered science. And also, there is the things like eugenics. Of course, has been a disaster in the world, in America and in Germany. Britain too, yeah. Yes, ma'am. Okay, so it's a question about are the evolutionists honest in their rejection? I'd say if you believe Romans 1 to be true, that people have no excuse, there must be some culpability in their acceptance of evolution somewhere down the track, okay? There must be some culpable rejection of God and design somewhere. But once they've made this culpable rejection, then they probably are following honestly from that faulty premise. So you might find some of the evolutionists are actually arguing for the honesty from that premise, but there's still some culpability to make that choice to reject the designer and accept an atheistic viewpoint. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Dawkins himself tends to let his thralls do his dirty work for him. That's the way he seems to operate. You see, I think he won't debate me. He's debated creationists before, about 25 years ago, and at the Oxford Union debate, and basically, even in a secular audience, the victory for Dawkins was so narrow. Over 100 people voted for the creationists made the better case. You see, he doesn't want to do that again. He doesn't want to make that mistake again. Some of his admirers have said that I'm a flea on Dawkins' back. But in fact, Dawkins is a flea on the Bible's back. The Bible is by far the big bestseller, and Dawkins is just a flea on the Bible, really, trying to explain that evidence away. Yes, sir.
Okay, folks, we're going to have to shut down the Q&A here. It's 10 minutes to. NBC's got a fantastic comedy program here for you. Thanks for coming. We got to cut it at this point, but let's give Dr. Sarfati a great round of applause.